Hello, everybody. Welcome to Picks or Players, a Dynasty Fantasy Football podcast with some betting as well. And in this episode, we're going over the Week 12 slate game by game, and I'm going to be talking about certain players and bets that I like throughout the week. And so, let's just kind of get started. And in tonight's game, we got the Steelers in Cleveland against the Browns. The Steelers are 3.5-point favorites over Cleveland. And in this game, I think obviously with it being a AFC North showdown, you should expect it to be a low-scoring game. But I think both of these offenses, I should say, I apologize, have been playing a lot better recently, and I think especially with the quarterback changes for both teams, they've had a lot more of a passing attack. Like as we've seen Cedric Tillman and Jerry Jeudy and even Elijah Moore have solid games with Jameis Winston at quarterback. The wide receiver core for the Browns looks a lot better than in recent weeks. And then Njoku's getting involved a lot more. So, I think all of those guys have been pretty solid starts for fantasy ever since the quarterback change. I don't know if that will really, I don't really know if that will be too much different with this game, even though they are going up against a very strong defense. So maybe I would lower the floor a little bit, but I still think all of these guys could be productive this week. And then if we go on to the Steelers offensively, George Pickens has just been a great player to start in your leagues with Russell Wilson as the quarterback. I think with guys like Calvin Austin too showing up in the deep passing game, and now with Mike Williams in the fold, they have a lot more options in the receiving game than they did earlier in the year as well. So Russell Wilson's been playing a lot better, and I just feel like that this is a game where I think obviously both of the defenses are pretty strong, but I just feel like that we could see potentially a better duel than we expect. I still think the Steelers will pull away in this game. Their defense just has so many playmakers, and Jameis Winston is prone to make some game-breaking mistakes. So I think the Steelers definitely have an edge in that regard. But I really wouldn't be surprised if this was an exciting game from an offensive perspective, even with how good the defenses have been, like I've said. Moving on from that, we have the Chiefs in Carolina. The Chiefs are 11-point favorites. Jesus, would you expect anything less? Even though the Panthers have been playing a lot better recently, this should be a game that the Chiefs should put away no problem. And if they don't, I think that would be very concerning for their championship aspirations. So I'm definitely dumbing down the Panthers and their expected production this week. Although we will see Jonathan Brooks play this game, and maybe that will add a different factor to the Panthers offense that we haven't seen before. I'm not saying that, that it will cause it to be a close game or anything like that. That would be ridiculous. But, maybe we will see a different element of the Panthers this week with Jonathan Brooks in the offense. And maybe that will provide some hope in the future for the Carolina Panthers against some of these better teams. We've seen them be able to dispatch of some weaker opponents in the past few weeks. But this is way too big of a test for them currently where they're at. But at the end of the day, it will be interesting to see if the Carolina Panthers can have a competent performance against such a great team. I do think this will be a lower scoring game. But I think one positive I'll say about the Chiefs recently that isn't too obvious is that Xavier Worthy is starting to get a little bit more attention from Patrick Mahomes, which you really like to see, and they really need to get that deep part of the passing game going. But outside of that, hopefully Kansas City will be a little bit more consistent offensively with the rest of their weapons. But yeah, overall, this will be an interesting game to watch just for the long term. But I wouldn't expect a close game or anything like that. But after that, we got the Vikings in Chicago against the Bears, and the Vikings have been a little shaky in recent weeks. mainly because of the declined performance of Sam Darnold, who really catapulted this team to an amazing start of the season, given what people expected after the injury to J.J. McCarthy. Their defense is obviously a lot better than I think people expected too. But overall, though, I think Chicago did show a decent amount of improvement last week against the Green Bay Packers. DJ Moore was a lot more involved, and Caleb Williams, the play calling was just so much more smoother for him, and he wasn't making as many overthrows. He was completing very easy passes, and he was able to run the ball a lot more with his legs. And I think that's are very important factors for him. He needs to be mobile. He needs to be moving around, whether it be in the pocket or down the field. And I just think those little small adjustments that Thomas Bryan made to the offense are very critical for Caleb's development. And even though they lost last week on a very heartbreaking blocked field goal, I think I would still feel very confident about the Bears going into this week. I think the Vikings will probably get it done just because I think their roster is a little bit better. But as long as the Bears can continue to improve offensively, I think that their weapons and their players too will be more invested to improve as well. The only player that I'm really concerned about right now is Keenan Allen. It feels like his production is just way off of where it should be. Odunze, he had a rough start to the season, but he's definitely starting to take a step forward now. But with Keenan Allen, he's the one player I'm kind of concerned about in terms of just how productive he will be moving forward. His yardage totals have just not really been there this year. He hasn't topped 50 yards in a single game this season, which is really concerning. But I do love Odunze. His talent is through the roof, and DJ Moore is obviously still should continue to be the number one wide receiver in this offense now that they're starting to look a lot better. In terms of the Vikings, there's not really much to say. Justin Jefferson should continue to smash, even though he hasn't really been as potent for fantasy in these past few weeks. But I think maybe Aaron Jones is, I'm pegging him down a little bit more given the increased involvement of Cam Akers. But overall, I do think that the Vikings should have a bounce back spot here, even though it is in Chicago. I do like the Vikings here, and I just think that they will have a lot more of a complete performance. I think Sam Darnold will bounce back after these past few couple rough starts. But that being said, it wouldn't shock me either if Chicago continued to improve like they did against the Green Bay Packers. Both of these teams, are very strong on paper, so it should be a good game. But I think the Vikings just have a little bit more in terms of a realized game plan, I should say. Chicago, I think it's if they need to have a ceiling game offensively for what their output has been this season in order to win games like this. Their defense is good, but I don't think their offense has enough consistent drives for that defense to be as good as it can be for the whole of the game. But if the Bears can improve consistently on offense throughout this game, then it could be very interesting. I just am not sure about that. But moving on from that, we got the Titans in Houston. They are 8-point underdogs against the Texans. And I would say that the Titans, they've really haven't been good this year at all. But there are some signs of them kind of getting better, I would say. Even though last week's game against the Vikings, they still lost by 10. I think Will Levis has been a little bit better over the past few weeks. Let's kind of look at the PFF grades here. He's coming off a 72.5 grade and a 69.8 grade which is a huge bounce back over some of the performances he had earlier this season. I mean, he was playing some of the worst quarterbacking in the NFL. And so, I mean, you just aren't going to get much done with that. I mean, obviously, their offensive line is horrific, and their defense. I mean, I think their defense has talent, but it's just taking some time for them to really figure it out. But they've been able to hold teams to some lower scores this season, and surprisingly, Nick Westbrook-Akine has been a solid contributor for them this year too. So I think him and Ridley have opened up some options for the passing game. And Tony Pollard obviously has been pretty solid as a running back. So they have some options. I think in this game, it really all depends on how much their pass rush can get after CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud has been a little disappointing this season, especially with how bad the offensive line has been. But I will say that I do feel like that they are starting to kind of get back a lot of their mojo with how good Joe Mixon has been, and Nico Collins is back, and he looked pretty explosive against the Cowboys game, even though he got a huge play called back. I think in this game, though, it really just depends on if CJ can continue to be his normal self. And if he's not, then the Titans may legitimately have a chance to win this game. I think it will be closer than people expect just because of how bad the Texans' offensive line has been. Even though they pulled away against the Cowboys, there were still signs of those offensive struggles in that game. It just depends on really that, and can Will Levis keep holding himself back from making a critical mistake? Those are really the key factors of this game. But, outside of that, I would continue to rely upon Joe Mixon and, put Nico Collins in your starting lineups. Both of those guys are great players. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say about that game. And I think it may be a bit of an interesting game for this week. The Lions are in Indianapolis against the Colts. The Lions are 7.5-point favorites. There's not much to say about this game other than I do expect that the Lions will continue their dominant trend of just demolishing opponents right now. The Colts are not a terrible team, but I think they just don't have enough to stop this Lions offense, and they still have so many question marks on offense. Even though Anthony Richardson did look pretty good against the New York Jets. I do think Richardson will continue that trend, playing a lot better. But it's just a matter of whether or not the other weapons can continue their consistency. Michael Pittman still is playing injured, and it's really affected his production. Josh Downs has been very solid this year, and he's a guy that I would continue to mark as the leading receiver, I should say, of this Colts offense until Pittman is fully healthy, which probably won't even really be until next season. But I think both of those guys are having an interesting year in terms of just kind of how they've kind of flip-flopped as the number one and number two. But outside of that, though, Amon-Ra St. Brown, I would expect him to have a huge game, and we'll see what happens with the rushing attack. The Colts are a little bit better of a run defense, but I do think that the overall the Lions will still be able to execute their game plan in this game. It's just a matter of whether or not the Colts defensively can make some plays on Jared Goff, whether it be making a sack or catching an interception or something like that, forcing some turnovers. That would be the really critical aspect of this game. But overall, I wouldn't counter bet on those things happening. I think the Lions will take care of business here in Indianapolis. Moving on from that, we have the Patriots against the Dolphins. The Dolphins, have been playing a lot better since the return of Tua Tagovailoa. that are starting to kind of show their colors as the team that we expected them all to be this year. They're really relying on A-Chain. I mean, A-Chain has been phenomenal this season. Jonnu Smith has become kind of a breakout player for the Miami offense this year. Tyreek Hill is also starting to kind of come back into himself too. But overall, it's something still feels off about this team. Especially with the disappearance of Jalen Waddle. I mean, it has just been. I mean, after breaking out for a 100-yard game against the Jaguars in Week 1, he hasn't topped a game over 60 yards. So I feel like with Jalen Waddle, I mean, we really have to temper our expectations for him moving forward. He has not been the player I think anyone wants him or expected him to be at this point of his career. And then this offense is just having to continue to rely on Tyreek in the running game. I still believe in Tua. I think Tua is playing a lot better as a quarterback, but until they're able to unlock that Jalen Waddle thing, I'm still having a little bit of a concern of their overall offense and whether or not it can be as explosive as it has been in recent years. The Patriots, have looked a lot better over the past few weeks as well. Drake May looks like a very solid quarterback. Even though they didn't win last week against the Rams, they still put up a pretty good performance, I would say. And it just their main factor is whether or not they can really find the key playmakers in this offense. It seems like each week a different wide receiver is stepping up. They have no real clear number one in this passing game. And the running game has really what they've been having to rely upon. But Ramondre Stevenson, he hasn't been as consistent as he usually has been. He's had some great games, and he's also had some really bad games for his standards. And Miami's defense is pretty tough. They've had some good performances over the past few weeks, especially against running backs like Kyron Williams, and they've really been able to limit those guys from having as explosive of a game. So that leads me to two bets that I'd like for this game. One is Tua Tagovailoa's over 2.5 rushing yards. This is a bit of a riskier one just because he really hasn't been running at all to not risk anything, but he still has had some scrambles. One for 3 yards and one for -1 yard. He had 0 rushing yards against the Raiders, but 2.5 seems like a pretty low total. I'll take that over right now just to kind of see if it's just such a low barrier of entry. I love those kind of bets where you can just expect very little, and if you get it, you get a big reward. And then moving on from that, kind of relating into Ramondre, I like his under 55.5 rushing yards. It just has been too much of a inconsistent struggle this year. I think this is a good matchup to take the under. He's kind of had such a very unpredictable season that 55.5 yards seems like a pretty high threshold to beat against a good run defense. Let's move on from that and go on to the next game. We have the Buccaneers in New York against the Giants. I believe both of these teams are coming off a bye, so that should be interesting. And also Tommy DeVito is starting this game as well. To be honest, I think a lot of people are panicking about DeVito starting for fantasy, and people are very much downgrading Malik Neighbors for the rest of the year. But, who's to say that this can't be an improvement? I think Malik Neighbors should continue to be the focal point of this offense, and maybe DeVito has a better game than people expect. I don't think he's going to look awful against this Bucs team. That being said, I think the Bucs will win. I just think they have more going for them on offense, especially with their duo of running backs and Kate Otton's breakout, and Mike Evans is also returning for this game, and he should really be you should really have high expectations for Evans for the rest of the season. But overall, though, I do think this could be a tighter game than people expect. But I do confidently say that the Bucs will win. I just think that maybe the fact that they went to DeVito over Locke, obviously, I think people viewed that as a financial decision to sell more tickets to the game. But who knows? I think from a football perspective, Drew Lock, as a Seahawks fan, I can say that, he never really captivated me as a starter. But, DeVito, I think he did show some good signs last year. It was just also there was just so many kind of weird and bad plays too. But, I think there is a little bit more upside with DeVito, as weird that is to say, than Drew Lock. But yeah, let's move on from that game. We got the Cowboys against the Commanders. They're 10.5-point underdogs in Washington, DC, I should say. but yeah, no, I do think that the Cowboys, kind of like I was saying last week against the Texans, this could be another spot for them as an underdog where they could surprise some people. The game on Monday night was not impressive, and they didn't really play all that great. But there were some moments there where it could have been a close game. And I will say that I do think that Cooper Rush will perform better against the Commanders than the Texans. Just because the Commanders, they don't have as many playmakers on defense. Even though I do think their defense is pretty good, and Dan Quinn has done a good job of coaching them up. But we've seen, some regression from Jaden Daniels. I don't think enough to be concerned about him at all. I just am saying that because of his injuries, he's definitely had a lesser output of efficiency from what we saw earlier into the season. I do think, though, that the Commanders, they need some help on the receiving side of the ball. They do not have a lot of depth there. And as we saw against the Eagles, Terry McLaurin kind of got shut down for a lot of that game, and they were not having any passing game whatsoever. They were having to move the ball by relying on Zach Ertz. And I think that's a very concerning aspect of their offense moving forward. You cannot be that one-dimensional and be successful in the NFL. And even though the Cowboys are lacking on so many aspects of their roster, I do think that this is a game where it wouldn't shock me if the Cowboys somehow pull off an upset, just because the Commanders have kind of been a little lackluster in the past few games. Holistically, they were very lucky to be in that game against the Steelers because of that fake punt call. And last week, it felt like that they had a great start to the game against the Eagles, who kind of got in their own way a little bit in the first half. But the Commanders, really didn't put up that much of a fight in the second half, and they didn't really look all that great offensively. So I do think there is some concern of regression coming for this Commanders team. And, I do think that the Cowboys are a little too unfairly priced in the betting lines. They're not good. The Cowboys are not good at all. But let's just put that out there. But it wouldn't shock me that they put up a better performance in this game, just given how the Commanders are struggling. But yeah, moving on from that, we got the Broncos and the Raiders. The Broncos are 6-point favorites in Las Vegas. And Jesus, Bo Nix is making me look like an idiot. He is playing so well over the past couple weeks. Ever since I said that you should sell him in Dynasty, I'm just like, gosh, what is going on? He's been playing unreal. He's been playing phenomenal, and he probably will continue to play phenomenal in this game against this bad Raiders team. But I will say, I do like Devon Bailey under 31.5 receiving yards. I feel like that total's a little high for him. He's been involved a lot more recently, but I think that this is a game where maybe this is a good spot to fade him. I like Sutton a lot more in this offense. His ceiling is much higher, and there's also just other kind of random Broncos receivers that get involved throughout the game. I've not much to say about this game other than, I do think the Broncos win. They're just so much of a better coach team. Their defense is solid. And the Raiders, I mean, they just really have not shown much to me at all as a team. I mean, I thought last week that they would have a better performance than they did against the Dolphins, and they were able to move the ball a little bit, but just overall though, they can't get a stop. And that's the problem with this team, is like their defense is depleted. But yeah, moving on from that, we get the Niners in Green Bay. The Niners lost to the Seahawks last week. Woo woo. But they are starting to look out on the outside looking in of the playoffs. It seems unlikely that they will make it now just because of that loss. It'll be they really would need to win these next two games against the Packers and the Bills to really look like they could come back. This Packers team, I do think they're very solid. I like how Jordan Love is playing, even though he's had a little bit of some turnover issues this year. But a lot of quarterbacks can go through that, and I think people do overrate the penalty of an interception. There actually are some statistical studies on this that a sack can be worse for your win percentage than an interception, which is strange to say, but it's true. And I think the logic behind that is that when you throw a pick or something like that, then the defense has a lot more urgency to respond and make a stop than necessarily if you're way deeper down the field off of a punt. The way the offense calls the plays in those kind of situations is different too. And being in a sack, you're kind of putting you're wasting time off the clock, and you're probably going to be giving the ball back to the other team anyway. So the difference between them, honestly, is kind of negligible. And I can see why a sack could affect the win probability a lot more. But yeah, anyway, that was a big digression for no reason. But yeah, no, I do think the Packers will take care of business in this game. The Niners are just lacking so much on offense right now. Even though Purdy is playing well, and I still like him overall as a quarterback, the biggest concerns for me right now are the health, obviously, of this 49ers team, and also the fact that, Christian McCaffrey has just not been as efficient since his entry back into this season. Obviously, we should have expected some of that, with his Achilles tendonitis. But I did think that, even though I did think that he would be a lot better than this, from what I was reading about the injury, that it really shouldn't have affected his output this much. But maybe it is. So we may have to temper our expectations for Christian McCaffrey the rest of the season. Obviously, he's still a major factor of this offense. And the key, basically, for them the rest of the season is, can they get him going to be his elite self? Because against the Seahawks, my team, he has decimated them time and time after again, ever since he's been on the roster. And we were able to kind of slow him down a bit. So, that was surprising to me. But yeah, we'll see how Christian McCaffrey continues to play the rest of the season. But I do like the Packers in this spot. I just think that they are the better team. The Niners are just so reliant on their star players being healthy to really make a difference in games. They don't have a ton of depth. So it will be interesting to see how they bounce back from last week's loss. But the Packers, they do look like a much better squad overall. Cardinals at the Seahawks. That's our next game. Speaking of my buddies, the good old Seattle Seahawks. They're coming off a great victory against the Niners, and this is going to be a very pivotal game for the race of the NFC West. The Seahawks, I do think they need to win this game if they want to make the playoffs, just because Arizona has been so good. If they lose this game, they'd have a 2-game deficit, and with how many games are left and who they're playing against, it'd be very hard for them to make up that difference if they lose this game. Um, the Cardinals, though, their offense is very weird. Kyler Murray is playing pretty well, but they still have yet to really unlock Marvin Harrison Jr. consistently. And if the Seahawks can really kind of just put Marvin and Trey McBride in check, which I think is possible, then this game becomes a lot more interesting. It just is a matter of, can Geno Smith continue to keep leading the Seahawks team to dubs? And I think he can. I mean, he has just been so clutch in many situations this year. You take away the Rams game, yes, I know that performance was ugly, but he still had a really good game. If you look at the tape, he was so dialed in on that 2-minute drill in both of these games, in both weeks, I should say. Geno is playing at a very good level, and if he can just keep the mistakes at bay and not really take too many risks. I mean, he has the wide receiving core and the offense to be able to take care of business. I do think this is actually going to be a lower scoring game, though, so that being able to kind of limit those turnovers and limit the time of possession for the Arizona Cardinals will be critical for the Seahawks team. So I do think it'll be a very defensive game. And if anything, the Cardinals are going to need to have Marvin Harrison and Trey McBride have great games if they're going to want to beat the Seahawks team with the amount that they have going on for them right now, especially now that JSN is ascending as the player that he is. I'm very excited for this game. I'll be there. It's going to be tight, but I think the Seahawks can get it done. It just really depends. Can Geno just keep being Geno and winning football games? After that, got Sunday Night Football with the Eagles against the Rams. This is going to be a fun game. Rams kind of need to win this game too if they want to stay in the NFC West race. I think Puka has looked great. Same for Cooper Kupp. Both of those guys have just been phenomenal since their return. But the Eagles, I do think that that Saquon Barkley has really added a new element to this team, and the running game is a lot. Like, they have to rely on Jalen Hurts a lot less. Who I don't think Jalen Hurts is playing at the level that he can. He's kind of had a down year, it feels like, in terms of just his overall passing efficiency. But I think the fact that they have Barkley really kind of just helps out this team on both sides of the ball. Their running game is so much better than it was last year. And I really feel like that it's added a new dimension. The Rams, their offense has been pretty good, but it's their defense that has been a lot more impressive over these past few weeks. The young players are really stepping up for them. And if they can continue to do that, they could win this game. But I'm just overall kind of concerned about Stafford's overall play. Doesn't really feel like that he's been as sharp in recent weeks, even though Puka and Cooper Kupp have been so good since their return. I just think that overall they haven't had as many explosive plays. A lot of their drives have been long and grindy, which they can afford to do, especially with how good Kyron Williams is. But I just think the Eagles offensively have a much better identity front to back, and that has really kind of allowed them to not be as sharp. Whereas I think the Rams really need to be on all cylinders to be able to win games like this. After that, we have the Ravens and the Chargers. on Monday Night Football. I'd like the Ravens in this spot. I think kind of like I've said over the past few weeks, their running game is just so good, and Lamar continues to play at an MVP level. The big challenge, I think, for this game is whether or not they'll be able to kind of run the ball as well as they have been. The Chargers defense is pretty good, and Justin Herbert is playing at a great level. So I think the big factors of that are whether or not they're just going to be able to continue to do that consistently. And I think they can. I think this Chargers team is a great story, but I don't know if they're a great team. And I think Baltimore is a step ahead of them, and I would expect them to take care of business in this game. But yeah, no, that's pretty much all I got for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and have a good one.